We are both occupational psychologists. We are based down in England. I'm near Oxford myself. Michelle's near Birmingham. Obviously, we're in the same place right now, as you can see. And we work with organisations around learning and development type things typically, but alongside the workshops that we run, we like to create things like the strengths cards, as you've seen. So we'll give you a sense of those today. And Michele, over to you.
So in terms of the sorts of workshops we run, they're often coaching or mentoring or leadership workshops, a wide range. And I guess we were looking for tools to use in our work that we could help people to identify their strengths. And so that's how the strengths cards came about, for developed to use for our work. And I guess the background to all of this is positive psychology. For those of you who have done worked in the area of positive psychology, then you will be aware of, I can change the slides. You might well be aware of this continuum. So this idea of psychology traditionally having focused on how can we fix people, how can we put things right, how can we correct those critical weaknesses, and a huge amount of work has been done in that area within psychology. And there was a recognition 20 or so years ago that there might be the opportunity to shift the focus a bit and to start building more on what's working. And so this continuum really is sort of showing that -10 to +10, and that we often still, certainly within the workplace, focus on the -10 to 0. So how can we shift people back to being okay? How can we get rid of those mistakes and problems, rather than looking at how do we get people from 0 to +10? So how can we help people to truly flourish, to be much more than okay and actually be moving towards brilliant? And what research in positive psychology has shown is that what we need to do to get people from 0 to +10 is quite different to what we need to do to get them from -10 to 0. So we need a whole load of different strategies and approaches if we're going to move people in that positive direction. But that's not to say that you can't be doing both at the same time. So there's absolutely a recognition that life happens, and quite often there's something that's not quite right in their life. So it isn't the case that we have to get to 0 before we can start moving towards the +10. Actually, we might be experiencing challenges, and some recent research that's come out of Australia has suggested that people can be living with lots of challenges, ill health, etc., and actually thriving, living very well. So there are two continuums, and they sort of run side by side a little bit. In terms of positive psychology and what does it mean to actually be flourishing, the sort of godfather of positive psychology has put together a model that we just wanted to talk you through briefly.
Martin Seligman is a name that some of you may be familiar with, and his work around what are the factors that help people to be at their best and to flourish. And this PERMA acronym, with the H sneakily added by a number of people around the world in recent years, is what captures that. So the first of those elements is positive emotions. We need to experience happiness and joy and various different kinds of positive emotion in order to be at our best. Obviously that doesn't mean there are no negative emotions, it's just that we need to have a balance towards positive. We need to be engaged with what we're doing. So if you think the times when you get lost in your work, you experience flow, you're fully absorbed in what you're doing, that's engagement. Relationships are probably the most important aspect of this framework in terms of having good quality connections with other people, helping us to be at our best and to have high levels of well-being. Meaning, of course, is important, so we need a sense of purpose to what we're doing. And we also need to have a sense of accomplishment, so that we are achieving things and making progress on towards our goals. And the H that's been sneakily added, not by Martin Seligman, but some other people since, is health. So, of course, to be at our best, we need to be physically healthy. So we need good nutrition, we need good sleep, and we need exercise. And those things all together contribute to help create thriving individuals.
One of the really interesting things is that building on your strengths and playing to your strengths sort of taps into quite a lot of these elements. So when we're playing to our strengths more, we experience more positive emotion, we're more likely to be engaged, and so on. You get the drift. And that's one of the main reasons why we often focus on strengths in our work, because a lot of our work is around how do we improve people's well-being. But it's also true to say that focusing on strengths is a way of building performance too. So there's research suggesting that you're more likely to achieve your goals if you are focusing on strengths. There's research around managers focusing on staff strengths and that having a significant impact upon productivity and performance. So whether you're looking at well-being or whether you're looking at performance or some combination of both, there's a growing body of evidence to suggest that if we focus on people's strengths, help them to use their strengths more often, then they are going to benefit both from a well-being and a performance perspective. And what we're really talking about here, to be honest, in many ways, is just shifting our focus. So when we're running workshops, what we're quite often talking to managers or staff about is how do they shift their focus to be taking more of a strengths-based approach, because the quote from William James of my experience is what I choose to attend to. The more I focus on strengths, the more likely I am to notice strengths, the more likely I am to have the opportunity to build on my strengths. So we spend a lot of our time saying, actually, what we're trying to do is just encourage you to ask different questions, not ask questions about what's not working, but ask questions about what is working. What are my strengths rather than what are my weaknesses? Not that those things aren't important. Weaknesses are important. We do need to be aware of them. We shouldn't be pushing them under the carpet, but shifting that focus gives us quite a different impact. And when we think about what are we talking about when we talk about strengths, we're talking about the inner qualities that shape who you are at your best. That's our definition. And what we mean by that is we mean those things that that you love to do, but also that you're great at. And on top of that, they're often the things that run through your life in different ways. So they might run from childhood through to adulthood. They might run through different parts of your life. So the example that I often use for me is if you ask my parents, then they will tell you that my books, age 8, all my books were on my bookshelf in alphabetical order. And if you talk to my husband now, then he will tell you that I write the shopping list in the order of the supermarket. I don't understand why you wouldn't do that. It makes complete sense to me that you would do that.
Takes all the fun away. That's why you wouldn't do it.
So the sense of order is a strength of mine. And so it runs through my life in terms of things that I did as a child through to adulthood. And you might be able to identify those things. Although, to be honest, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a while, sometimes it's quite hard to spot those things in yourself because they're just the way you are. And that's one of the issues with strengths, is that quite often we don't value our own strengths as much as we should do because we know no different.
So it'd be interesting just for a second for you to contemplate your own strengths. So blank sheet of paper, if you've got a piece of paper in front of you, write down a few words. What are the words that spring to mind that capture you at your best? What are the inner qualities that shape who you are at your best? That's something we sometimes ask people to do on workshops. At some of the masterclass events, we often do that. And some of you might be in full flow now, writing a long list of all the qualities that you possess. Some of you might still have a blank piece of paper. And there can be a number of different reasons for that. Now, what we find is that often people are, for various reasons, uncomfortable talking about their own strengths. And even if it's not that they're uncomfortable, it's just they're not used to having those kind of conversations. It's kind of a bit awkward to do. Now, sat on your own, possibly at a desk looking at the computer, maybe a less intimidating kind of situation to answer that question. But if you're being asked by somebody else, by a colleague, by a friend, it's a bit awkward. I can still remember very clearly the first time somebody asked me about what my strengths were. I had no idea what to say. It was just an unusual question to be asked and quite a difficult one to answer. And in part because I'd not had those questions before, I didn't have the vocabulary around that. I didn't quite have the framework in which to give a sensible answer to that question. And that's a real shame, given that we know that there's a lot of value to people getting a better understanding of their strengths. There's lots of evidence to support that. So that's why we were concerned that people perhaps weren't able to tap into that understanding about when they're at their best, and that's ultimately why we've created the cards to help to have those kind of conversations. Would you want to talk through some of the research background briefly?
Talk briefly through some of the research. So these stats here are taken from a few different sources, but basically people who use their strengths more are much more likely to be engaged at work, 6 times more likely to be engaged, have higher levels of self-esteem and confidence, have higher levels of energy and vitality, and experience less stress and are more resilient. And given those sorts of stats, then you do wonder why we aren't doing more of this within organisations. Some of the specific research projects that are being carried out now, you can see from the date on this that this research was carried out quite a while ago now, but it was really impactful. And it was done by Martin Seligman, that Martin mentioned earlier with the PERMA model. And what he looked at was a 1-week intervention. So this is something that the group of subjects took part in for 1 week. They identified their strengths, and then they went through a process of being challenged to use one of their top 5 strengths in a new way each day for a week. So just for 1 week. And they measured, the researchers measured their levels of depression and level of happiness over a period of 6 months. And you can see the results. So from a 1-week experiment, the impact lasted for 6 months and potentially longer. So levels of happiness stayed higher, crept up and stayed higher, and levels and depressive symptoms actually reduced. It's quite impressive for a 1-week intervention. Oh, I think I've gone over a couple of slides there. No, maybe not. Okay.
just change the order.
Just keep me confused. So in terms of some much more recent research that's just come out from Lucy Hone and some of her colleagues in New Zealand, people who are most aware of their strengths are up to 10 times more likely to be flourishing. So that's just simply having an understanding of what your strengths are. And actually, if you use your strengths, then you're up to 15 times more likely to be flourishing. So that definition of flourishing, Martin mentioned earlier about the positive emotions and so on. People who are flourishing have higher levels of optimism, higher levels of energy, are more connected, more engaged in their environment. All of those things that we would think about if you think about someone living well, all elements of flourishing. So you can see understanding and using your strengths can have a really big impact on a day-to-day basis. And here you go, showing some more of that research, which is actually showing that within organizations that are going through change, where they are building on strengths and making people aware of their strengths and managing by strengths, they're far more likely to be successful in implementing change programs. And not only that, but those people who are living well, despite struggles, where they're building on strengths, they're more likely to be doing well. So some significant research and growing research out there to show that there are lots of benefits of taking a strengths-based approach.
And one of the ways that people typically do take a strengths-based approach is to use online questionnaires, and maybe some of you can share in the comments if you've used online questionnaires to measure strengths before, or to get a better understanding of what your strengths are or what a client's strengths are. What kind of tools have you used? Perhaps you could share with us on the chat if there are examples of online questionnaires that have done that job well for you before. Yeah, thanks, Lauren. Yeah, so Clifton Strengths Finder. Yeah, that's a very popular questionnaire. It's been used by, I think last time I looked, about 10 million people who'd used that questionnaire online. It's a US-based tool. It's very popular with the books that go with it, of course. Anybody else use any different ones? Yeah, VIA. So yeah, thanks, Deacon. Yeah. VIA is good in another sense. It's free. So if you want to go and have a look at the questionnaire, then that's a nice one to be able to do. Again, it's American. It's been validated around the world, but it's developed by Americans, and it has that feel to it, and is quite long to complete sometimes. So yeah, there's different others. And sorry, you're going to mention some of the other ones.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say about the VIA, the fear that it's been widely used in research. So a lot of the research that we or other people might quote about strengths often has used the VIA questionnaire as the basis for that research, and it's robust in that sense. It's been well tested. So from a research perspective, it's a good tool to be used. But those, as Martin mentioned, both of those are American-based questionnaires, and you can tell that a little bit in the language. Doesn't, you know, it's absolutely fine, but you can see that they are US-based. The fact that it's affordable, that it's the basic questionnaire is free, and there's a youth version as well, isn't there, which some people find very useful. So it's definitely worth looking at their website if you are interested in knowing more about strengths and strengths questionnaires. It's certainly where we would suggest people go first. There are two more in the UK.
Yeah, so there's Strength Scope, which is a UK tool, and there's also Strengths Profiler.
Used to be realised too.
Yeah, it was realised too until fairly recently. So there are a number of these different tools around. They're all well and good, but we also think there are some advantages to taking a different approach, and that stems partly from the type of experience that we've noticed about how people tend to engage with those online questionnaires. Now, if you imagine that you are coaching one of us, and you ask us to go away and complete this questionnaire, then it wouldn't be unusual for our response to that to be, okay, I've done my bit, I've answered the questions that you've asked me, or that the online questionnaire has asked of me, and now I'm putting the responsibility back to you as the coach, as a professional, to say to me, what does this say? What's the interpretation? What does the magic black box say about me? And you as the expert help to interpret that, because sometimes these tools use language which is a bit idiosyncratic, and you as the expert will be much more familiar with what those terms actually mean and can help make sense of it for me. Now, of course, you can manage that conversation as a professional. You can help facilitate that so that the onus stays with the client to understand what that means for them. But we think in some ways that dynamic isn't especially helpful, particularly when we're focusing on development. In many of the situations where we want people to get a better understanding of their strengths, we don't need there to be an objective, reliable, robust measurement behind that. What we need to do is for them to be able to answer those questions and do that self-reflection in a more insightful way. And those tools can help you to get there. But they can lead to something else where people maybe expect there's going to be some great insight that comes basically from answering a few questions. And for some people that does happen, for many it doesn't. And what we find actually can work just as well, or actually in many cases better, is by allowing people to tell their own story and facilitating them through that process so that they get a better understanding of when they've been at their best before, what those strengths look like. And in fact, getting people to share stories with each other as well, to share different perspectives of when I see you at your best, because that's not always in alignment. Sometimes we may overlook some of the strengths that we have, as Michele said earlier. We may overlook them thinking, well, that's just me, that's just how everyone does things, without realizing actually perhaps that is a natural strength for us. So that's kind of ideally really where we developed the concept of the strengths cards, was trying to help that dynamic become a little bit more, as I've described, in favour, if you like, of the client on the receiving end of and telling their story.
Yeah. So what are the cards? Well, some of you have probably seen them, and Graham had a packet that he was showing earlier on, and we've got some more here. Basically, it's 48 cards inside a pack, and what you've got is you've got single words on one side and you've got images on the other. And those of you who've got packs, you'll probably have noticed there's a loose connection between the word, which is supportive here, and the pylon on the back there. And it is intentionally a loose connection, and intentionally there are no words on the picture side, because you'll see in the next bit of the webinar that the ways we use them, we want to allow for people to interpret the words and the images however they want to. So we don't want people to be constrained by the word on the back. So the only reason really for there being a loose connection between the two is simply so they don't jar. When people turn them over, they can see that connection. But what we want from the photos in particular is we want people to be able to interpret those in a broad range of ways. We'll talk a bit more in a while about how we develop the cards, but just a couple of practical points about them at the moment. As I say, there are 48 cards. If you are using them as a facilitator, you might well notice, those of you with attention to detail as a strength, that the first 24 have got an orange number on them and the second 24 have got a grey number on them. And that's so that you can divide the cards in half. If you don't have enough for everybody in the room to have a pack of their own, you can split the cards, half a pack each, and you know you'll have a good spread of images and words within each half pack. Of course, they're different images and words, but in terms of having, for example, colour and black and white photos, photos of objects and photos of people, words that are maybe the more analytical head words alongside the more emotional words, and so on. So we talk about hand, head, heart words. So we've got a good mixture in both lots of 24 for those of you who end up using them in large groups. So they are really a very simple stimulus. That's the way we use them. It's a way to prompt a conversation. It's giving people permission to start talking about their strengths. And we've found that simply having the cards, having something for people to look at, to hold, to sort through, takes away maybe a little bit of the stress of being asked that question about what are my strengths. It gives you something to focus on. And you'll see in a minute, we give some guidance and direction around what we ask of people. So we might ask them to pick one picture, 5 words, and giving those directions seems to enable people to actually focus and start coming up with their strengths, and then they're off. So we're just using the words and the images as a springboard for them then to be able to tell their stories. There are no definitions along with the words for that reason, because my interpretation of the word supportive, if that's a word I choose for me, is far more important than any definition that might be on there in terms of how we're using the cards. We want people to own their own development, own their own strengths. So we want them to put their own definitions and stories onto those words. And in fact, that can be a really valuable conversation. If I'm talking to my manager about where I see my strengths lying, my descriptions of my strengths, the language I use will be very informative for my manager, because we might have slightly different opinion as to what supportive means or approachable means and so on, and that can be a valuable conversation. So what we wanted to do was to give you a little chance to have a go at some of the exercises that we do. Now, we use the cards in one-to-one sessions, we use them in team builds with teams of 5, 8, 10, and we use them in large-scale sessions. So recently we ran a session at a conference where we had about 130 people in the audience. Everyone had a pack of cards, and we ran some exercises like that. So they're really flexible to the situation that you're in, and we'll try and give you a bit of a sense of that.
The other thing worth noting actually is if you are a consultant or a coach, as I'm sure some of you are, they make a really nice takeaway for clients or delegates from workshops to take away. Because they're so simple and practical, what you find is you can do a number of activities within the session, and people quickly can see the application of those activities to their own work. So if they are a manager themselves, they can then see, actually, I can do these things with my team. And so if they are able to take them away, if you can get the client ideally to go to that extra expense, and we find it's well worth doing that, because we often hear stories of people saying, well, my manager came on a workshop 6 months ago or a year ago, and she uses the cards almost every day or every week in some kind of discussions that we have as a team. So we know that they are getting repeated use, which of course then extends the value of the sessions that you're running. And the same with coaching clients as well. People often will want to take them home to think about the strengths that their family have, and to get feedback from their family and friends as well about how they see their strengths. So that flexibility makes them really valuable as a takeaway. So of course we would encourage you to do that, but genuinely they do have quite a lot of impact when you have that opportunity to do that. Obviously not practical all the time to do that. So we do have sets that we reuse for kind of workshops that we run.
Yeah, but as Martin says, there's an easy way to cascade learning from a session to 15 people and a way of getting it to 100 people in an organisation. It's a very simple way to do that. So one of the exercises that we often do in workshops is to get people, first of all, to start to think about their own strengths. And this is how that exercise would work. We would get people to go through the cards. They'd all have their own pack of cards. Pick a photo that reflects them at their best. Or we might say a story of success, a time when you have achieved a success. And that photo can be as literal or as abstract as you like in relation to the story they're thinking about. But they need to be thinking about a story, a time when they've been at their best. So we'd encourage them to think about that situation in some detail. What did they do? How did they behave? And then we go on to look at the word side. Now, often in a workshop situation, we actually get people to do this in pairs. So both people in the pair will pick their photo, think about their story, and then they will take it in turns. And one person, I might be the storyteller, I'll share my story with Martin and explain why I chose this photo, what was the story. And then he would listen and ask me questions about my story. And then we would both look at all the words on the cards and pick out the strengths. So I would pick out the strengths that I thought I showed in that situation, and Martin would pick out the strengths that he heard in my story that he thought I showed. And then we would have a conversation about the different words that each of us chose, and compare those choices and reasons, and then swap roles, and the other person becomes the storyteller and the other person becomes the listener. So that's a really lovely exercise because you can do it with people who don't know each other or who know each other well. And it's a way of getting validation of your strengths, because of course in that situation you go through, you're telling your story, you pick out your words, but then someone else validates that and shares what they've heard in your story. And people typically get a lot of feedback that is consistent with the things they thought they showed, but also some differences and some additional things as well. And quite often it starts to pick up those strengths that I mentioned earlier, those things that are the things you can't help but do. They are who you are, but you would never identify them as strengths. Obviously, someone else hearing your story will start to tell you those things. So we can't quite do that on this call, but we thought we would have a go as far as we can. So what we're going to ask you to do is we're going to show you some of the photographs from the cards. I'll let you look at this page for a moment, and then I'm going to show you another page of photos as well. And I'd like you to do, as I've just suggested in that exercise, I'd like you to find a photo that for you represents you at your best. And ideally a specific time, a specific situation that you were in where you felt you were at your best, or as a particular personal success. It can be something from work, something from home, something from 10 years ago, something from yesterday, small or big, it doesn't matter. Here's some other photos. And when you've picked your photograph, we'd encourage you just to write a few notes on that piece of paper where you were writing your strengths earlier. Just reflecting on what the situation was and what it was specifically that you did. So just the story for the moment, thinking about what was the situation, what was it you were doing.
Okay, so there's those first images again, just a reminder.
Okay, and then in a workshop situation, we give people longer, obviously, to either share their story with their neighbour or to write. It can be a really good exercise to encourage people to do some writing and write down their narrative. But once they've shared their story, then it's moving on to the words. So what strengths did you show in that story? So again, we encourage people to come up with 5 to 8 words. And again, we've given you some of the strengths cards here. So people go through the cards and pick out 5 to 8 words that they think they showed in that situation, and the listener picks out 5 to 8 as well. So again, I'd encourage you to do that.
So 2 different slides again here. So you've got a total of 32, is it? 32 cards showing. It's obviously helpful to make a note of those choices you're making, but in a workshop, obviously, you'd have the cards in front of you, and you'd be able to take a photograph of that as well as making a note.
Mm. And once we've got to that, it depends what we're trying to do in the workshop, but quite often once we've got to that point and people have got their words, then we have a conversation about, so what next? So what would happen if I asked you to do the same exercise again, but to pick a time from a different part of your life? And you can imagine if we did this a few times, then you would start to come up with a list of strengths, maybe those strengths that you show more often or more often in different situations. And then we can start to talk about, so how do those strengths show themselves? How do other people see those strengths? What opportunities do those strengths give you? Where are your opportunities to use those strengths more? And you can see then, going back to those stats about those people who know what their strengths are more likely to be flourishing, how we start to have an impact on people's awareness of their strengths, and also moving on to, so how can they be using their strengths more often to again have a bigger impact on well-being and performance.
So if you can summarise in a few words in the chat and let us know what you thought of that activity. Obviously it wasn't quite the same as doing it with the actual cards, and maybe some of you even got the cards in front of you and are using the cards instead of the ones on screen, but good to get some initial reactions about how you found that brief introduction as one of the exercises that we do. Thanks, Lauren. Yeah, that's a good point, Graham. Yeah, and that's one of the things we find actually is that taking this kind of approach makes it more natural to move on to what the next steps might be, rather than it feeling like an end point where perhaps producing a report you get from those online questionnaires has more of a sense of I finished, whereas this clearly feels like the start of an exploration, and then that leads you to what do you do next.
And it moves you away from the labelling as well, to Lauren's point about sort of the top 5 and being labelled with these are my top 5 strengths, which reports can have a bit of that sense about them. Whereas the more exploratory approach, because you're using your own language, your own stories, I think moves away from that.
Mm. Yeah, it's a good point about the icebreaker. So we often use them in a more substantial part of the session, given the nature of the content that we do. But we know that sometimes people, when the training isn't necessarily about strengths or about people's well-being or personal effectiveness or whatever, that the cards can still be very useful. So if you have them in your toolkit, then there's all sorts of things we can do. We run an introductory sort of icebreaker session quite often where we just lay out the photographs on the side. And so when people come in, we ask them to choose a picture, take the card with them, and then they use the photograph to introduce themselves. So it could be, for example, a simple question of why is it important for you to be here today? And then they choose a photograph that helps to articulate that answer. And then they use that for the instructions, and that works really nicely. But the question could be anything, particularly when you're using the photos. That really helps to kind of open up the conversation very well.
Yeah, and we sometimes use the words if we're maybe say we're doing a management course or a leadership course, and we ask everyone to pick a word that they think successful leaders show, for example. Again, just to prompt for a conversation around the strengths of successful leaders and how we can all show those differently, and all of those kinds of things.
So yeah, it's nice to see some positive reactions on your comments, so thank you for those. obviously we don't quite get a sense of energy in the room in the same way that we do with workshops, but when we do conference presentations and so on, it's very common to find that that there's real energy in the room, and that's really valuable in certain situations to get a sense that people are engaging and opening up and relaxing into the kind of environment you're trying to create. That's yeah, you have to take our word for it on that and go and test it out for yourself if you haven't already. So Graham, you say you use them alongside experiential activities. Oh, the comments are coming so fast I can't see it anymore because I've just you can tell I'm not used to using the multitasking between the slides. Select words that relate to strengths displayed and observe during the activity. Oh yeah, I see. So yeah. Your brother did something like that, didn't he?
Yeah, he
in
did.
An educational context.
Yeah. Students who were away on a well, it's World Challenge for those of you who are familiar with World Challenge, so sort of a big outward bounds experience, and using them at the end of various parts of the expedition to share the strengths they'd seen in each other, which apparently worked very nicely.
Yeah, and the final comment that we just had there from Kim, we'll come back to that point actually in just a moment. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we wanted to give you an idea of another quick exercise that we do as well. So this one, it's great to obviously help people to reflect on their own strengths, but then appreciating someone else or starting to think about other people is an important part of this as well. And we talk a lot about strength spotting for everyone, but particularly for managers, and particularly if we're doing work around appreciation or gratitude. So this one, we'd encourage you to have a quick go at this as well. So think of someone you know well, can be inside or outside work, doesn't matter where. And then I'm going to show you some of the words again in a minute, and would encourage you to pick 3 or 4 words that reflect qualities that you appreciate in that person. And then what we do in workshops is we say, take a photo and send it to the person. Okay, we often tell them that at the end. So we let them do the exercise first and then say, right, now, let's take this a bit further, take a photo and send it and explain what you've been doing. So think of that person you know well and have a look at these words and think and try and pick 3 or 4 of them for that person. Obviously we can't do the photograph quite so well, but you might want to write them down and send them a message anyway.
We'll buy the cards and then you can take.
Yeah, then you can take a photo. Yeah.
You've got stock in there, haven't you, Graham?
There's one set, and here's some more. Okay. Yeah. So hopefully you get a sense of how that works. And again, if you've got any comments on the exercise, then please put them in the chat. We often get comments about how that sort of activity strengthens connections. You know, it's a very nice thing to do, to sit and think about somebody in that kind of way, and we rarely do it. We might appreciate good things that people do for us, but actually appreciating the qualities that we really value in them, we often don't take the time to do that, and certainly don't take the time to share our observations with people. So again, very much an appreciated exercise in workshops typically.
So conscious of time, so we've got a few more bits we want to get through with before we finish, and I'd like to just mention a brief exercise, another exercise very briefly before we finish. But just a quick overview of how the cards are developed for those of you who want a bit more of a sense of how we came to end up where we are. The reality is we often talk about them as just a set of 48 words and 48 images. In terms of what we described earlier, we want it to feel quite different and more organic than the other approaches you might take. But the reality is actually we did put a fair bit of work into identifying what those words and images should be. So we started with some research around the existing taxonomies around strengths and also looking at personality questionnaires, and that led us to create a number of different dimensions or strengths in in terms of the labels or the language we might want to use, we were very keen that they all were single words though, so that they fitted within a common format, which made them easy to digest when you're working with a fairly large number. We then did some online work, some survey work to try and narrow down that list, and we did some statistical work to narrow that down, and tested out both the from a numerical point of view, where there was a significant overlap between words, but also where words just weren't used very commonly, and so therefore where they didn't add value to the set as a whole. But also just a common sense check as well, and to some extent a cultural check. So we were very keen to make sure that these were applicable across a range of cultures. I'm sure they're not perfect, but generally they do work well. And once we had all the words, and we put a bit of time into identifying the right images, it was actually a bit of a labour of love for us. To be honest, very early on, we wanted them to be almost like two sets of cards in one, so the photographs were unrelated to the words on the other side. But that didn't work. It just got in the way, because people were forever turning over the cards and thinking, well, why is that word on the back of that photograph? It doesn't make any sense. So we did evolve that, and as Michele said at the beginning, the photograph is very loosely connected with the word, and we didn't want the photo to be limiting someone's understanding of what the word was. We wanted the word to be as free as possible for people to tell their own story. So we've tried to keep a very loose connection. But more importantly, really across the whole set, is the selection of images that we have, different kinds of content, subject matter, different colours. But we wanted all of them to have a positive emotional impact. So while they might not be your favourite pictures, some of them, we hope that there shouldn't be any in there that will create a negative emotion in you. That was important to us as well. So we do get lots of very positive comments about the images. There are some that are more commonly the favourites than others, and you can probably guess what they are. But we hope you enjoy them as well. Just very quickly to mention one other exercise that we do. So going back to the point that Kim made earlier, yeah, the appreciating somebody else. The one way that we've just done that was the picking out the cards and sending a picture. It can be even more powerful when that's done in the moment in the room. We love to do this with teams who know each other and work together quite commonly. To hear what other people value about you and what they really appreciate is something that's quite rare and is hugely valuable, both in terms of understanding your own strengths, but also in terms of feeling appreciated, and in fact giving the appreciation. So we know that expressing gratitude and appreciation for somebody is good for the person who's expressing it, not just for the person receiving it. So this, in terms of strengthening those relationships, is hugely powerful. The simple way that we often do that, if you have a team who are sat around the table together, we can effectively put the spotlight on each person in turn, and then you can do it with just the one pack of cards on the table as a focus, but we often prefer to do it with everybody having their own pack, and they will sort through the cards and identify just one word that they associate with that particular person at their best. And then once everyone's chosen, we go around the table and each person holds up the card and they say why they've chosen it. And what we hear often in those examples are very powerful, very authentic examples about what people value in each other. So they're typically things like, remember last Tuesday when this happened and you said this to me, and then this was the impact that had. And those kind of comments and conversations feel so much more authentic than the things that you typically get out of competency-based frameworks, where people are trying to analyse and bring things up a level. They're much more tangible and therefore easier to act on and to replicate. And they feel much more genuine when someone's expressing those feelings. So if you can imagine sitting there and receiving that feedback from maybe 8, 9, 10 people around a table who work with you about what they value, that's a very powerful thing to be able to take away, to then consider, how do I make more use of those strengths? And of course, from everyone else's point of view, how do they make the most of those strengths that they see in me? And we can just work around the table and put the spotlight on each person around the table as we go, and ideally then capture that data as it's generated, so we can consider what the strengths are in a team as a whole and how we can make use of that. And so lots of different ways you can play around with that. Sometimes we do it as a kind of guess who activity, where people are talking about the strengths that they're identifying this person, but without saying who it is, and the rest of the room has to guess who they're talking about, and that can work really nicely too. So there's lots of opportunity to play and create, invent your own ways to do it. So yeah, that's how we do that.
And that we just wanted to mention another of our products very briefly, because it builds on the strengths cards basically. So this is At My Best 360, and it consists of a self-reflection activity and then a 360 activity. For those of you who aren't familiar with 360, it's the process of getting feedback from people all around you. So in our instance with At My Best 360, you can invite anyone who's got an email address. So we encourage people to invite friends, family, as well as work colleagues. And basically, you go through a process, a self-reflection process of picking out your strengths. You can see the words. It's very much like the cards on screen. So you pick out your strengths in a self-reflection activity, and then everybody else is invited to do the same for you. So you can have up to 12 people who go through and pick out some words, pick out some images for you, and they write why. So they type why they've chosen those words and those images for you. Again, same images that are on the cards. And then what you get out at the end of that is a very narratively driven output. So you get to see all the words that people have chosen for you in a strengths cloud, a word cloud. You get to see the overlap and the differences between the words people have chosen from you, and you get all those stories about what they really value in you. So it's a different approach, and obviously online, and we love the tactical nature of the cards for workshops and so on. But for those of you who are using 360 processes, then it might be something you're interested in. It's entirely strengths-based, so you can't give development feedback. It's all attributed, so you know who said what about you. And it's, like I say, it's all narratively driven. There's not a number in sight. So a very different process. But if any of you are interested in trying that out, then we'd be more than happy to send you a code so you can have a free trial. So if you just email us at that address with free trial in the subject line, then we'll send you back an email with a code so you can have a play if that's of interest to you.
Yeah, and do let us know how you find it, what you think, if you give it a try. My battery's running low. Can you turn the power on? We've plugged in and not turned the power on. It's lucky we haven't run out of power already, isn't it? And one last thing we wanted to mention, which is something that's brand new for us, and I'm not sure whether we've mentioned this to you before, Graham. The experience we've had with the cards of giving feedback to each other has been by far the most powerful way that we've used them. And often it feels like a gift that we're giving people by expressing what we appreciate and value and love about them. And we've been playing over the course of the last 6 months to a year with that concept about what would this look like if it was a gift. And Woohoo You is our new offer, which isn't launched yet. We're hoping that in about a month's time we'll be able to launch it, which is where we have a process that compiles a book for your nearest and dearest. So it might be a colleague, it might be a loved one, and it's a way of collectively sharing what you appreciate and love about that person. So a similar process to the 360 Michele was just describing, but a more personal use of that kind of technology. So that's something we're quite excited about, and that will be launching fairly soon, but you can find details about that at giveawoohoo.com. The website is functional but not finalized, so I would just warn you. So not quite ready yet. So that's everything we wanted to cover. Sorry, we'll probably take a little bit longer than we'd planned, but I'm happy to see if there are any questions at this stage, or Graham, if you have any other comments you want to come back with.
Thanks, Martin. And just if there's some comments coming in the chat, you could maybe pick them up. But I mean, really enjoyed today's session. It's great to hear the background, and I have to say, as a typical introverted West of Scotland engineer in terms of background, I can thoroughly endorse the idea of this activity of giving and receiving the cards in both work and non-work contexts. I think I mentioned on the chat to one or two people that I now use them all the time when I do one of our product demonstrations, and it's wonderful to see, you bring 8 or 10 strangers together, they do a little activity, and then they're immediately talking about, the strengths that they can see in people and what they brought to that activity. And I have to say, it's been really useful, not only from the word point of view, and again, being very literal, I tend to gravitate towards the words more than the pictures, but because we do a lot of work overseas, it's really handy to work in pictures when English isn't a first language. So it's another kind of side benefit, I think, that's been really, really useful for a number of our customers. So so congratulations on the tool, and I look forward to hearing more about the book.